Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we are continuing on with the one thing, Chapter 15, Live for Productivity. This just goes along with the previous two chapters that we did on the one thing discussing the iceberg. If you guys remember that the iceberg concept that Gary Keller introduces, pretty much everything that is of most importance, that is driving a human being towards working towards some sort of goal, is hidden underneath in the layer of the iceberg that you can't see, the layer that's underneath the ocean. And what lives underneath, well, we talked about that in chapter 13, which was purpose. You're living with a purpose. And then slightly above that, chapter 14, we talked about priority. So you live by priority. Chapter 15, we're talking about the top of that iceberg, which is the stuff that you see, the stuff that you see people doing. The purpose and the priority are the deep layers of the iceberg, which you can't really tell just by looking at a person. But the productivity you can see. You can see the day-to-day actions that people are taking place in order to move towards their stated purpose. And that's what we're talking about today, productivity. Productivity. So let's just kick things off. I'm going to go to the first slide. And I don't think it's a secret. Productive actions transform lives. And this concept of always doing something, even if you're not doing anything, you're doing something. You're doing something that's either positive, moving you towards your goal, or I guess negative, moving you away from your goal, or you're not really moving at all, which is still something. Even if it's nothing, it's something. I'm reminded of a quote I had on a t-shirt. I'm trying to remember right now. It was a quote on a strength and conditioning t-shirt that said, you pay a price for jumping higher, you pay a price for getting faster, you pay a price for getting stronger, and you pay a price for staying the same. So nothing, it's not like you do nothing and there's no consequences to it. Yes, there's still going to be consequences, even if you're doing nothing. Even if you're doing nothing, but the whole goal is to kind of just get the most out of what you do. Get the most out of what you do. And what Gary talks about here is in order to get the most out of what you do, you have to have a system in place. But it matters greatly what kind of system you put in place. So he goes through like a scenario where he's talking to some people, asking them, oh, well, what kind of planning software, planning organizational tools do you use? And Gary says, okay, that's cool. You have the tools. You have a piece of software that does this. But what kind of system do you use? And they ask him, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? And he goes on to say, well, if everyone has the same amount of time and yet some earn more than others, can we then say that it's how we use our time that determines the money we make? Because there is this notion that, yes, time is money. And if time is money, well, then the system that you use better be a very expensive system, for lack of a better word. You better be using that $1 million system, not the $5 system of organizing your time. Because again, if time is money, then you better treat the system in which you organize your time to meet your goals. That better be a very valuable system that you use. So what's the system that Gary advocates for that is the $1 million system? Well, it's this thing called time blocking. And time blocking is all about being productive in the hours you can put in. And specifically, you are blocking off time to work on your one thing. And then you block off this time repeatedly every single week, every single day, etc., in order to then make the block of time that you have set aside to work on your one thing into a habit, to then work towards knocking down the first domino, getting momentum started, and then moving ever closer to your goal, to your one thing. Right? And back when we were talking about balance, we have to remember this concept that disproportionate results come from disproportionate amounts of time. So you have to dedicate a disproportionate amount of time if you want that first domino to fall sometimes. Or, I mean, if you eventually want to get to your one thing. So once you have done your one thing for the day, you can focus on the everything else, but that everything else only comes from doing your one thing. And again, that's where this time blocking concept comes in. You're setting aside the time. And I think Gary talks about it in a way that literally you are scheduling. It's like a high school schedule or your schedule at college, where you literally have the hours marking off, hey, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., I'm working on my one thing. And then everything else after that, I'm free to do. I'm free to answer phone calls, talk to people, help other people out, listen to podcasts, watch YouTube. Those are my vices for sure. But those don't come about until the one thing is done. Let's go to the next slide. Time block your time off. So let me skip ahead here. So what he's talking about here, we're going to talk about three things. To achieve extraordinary results and experience greatness, time block these three things in the following order. So the first thing Gary says is he blocks off his time off, because that time is very valuable. That's recreation time. But it's funny because my dad always used to call it recreation time, and it's funny that Gary calls it the same thing. But it's for a purpose. It's very, very important to protect time, to give yourself time to rest, recharge, and reward yourself. Because you can't just work all the time. You're going to get burnt out. We've talked about this earlier in the book. You're going to get burnt out. But as Gary says right here, he underlines it on page 164, resting is just as important as working. So you need to protect those time periods where you need to recharge and reward yourself. Because again, it's a fuel tank. Your fuel tank is going to get low throughout the day. Your motivation to work on your one thing, it's going to get low. Well, then refuel. Get a snack, check email, send some texts, rest up, take a nap. I do that sometimes. Feel a ton better once you come out of that, because your tank is full. Now you're ready to go back to work. Go back to working on your one thing. Next, time block your one thing. And again, it comes after time blocking your time off, your recreation time. And it's interesting here, I've heard this described as far as salespeople, or as far as making money. Who was it? I think his name was Jim Rohn. Profits over wages. So regular folks get paid for the amount of time they put in. And then successful people get paid once the job is done. And it's this similar concept that Gary introduces on clock time versus event time. So clock time is, I work a 9 to 5. I'll see you at 5. Event time is, hey, I work until something gets done. It's the same thing with, and he says an example of a dairy farmer. There's not a certain amount of, dairy farmer doesn't clock out at 5. He clocks out when, hey, the last cow is milked. That might be earlier some days. That might be later some days. When I was a sales rep for the beverage company, I didn't have set hours. It was pretty much work until you get to your last store. You finish with your last store. That varied day to day to day. And plus, you could, what I would do sometimes is you would work extra. You would go out on Sundays, try to, take care of some things on the route. You would go out Saturdays, hit up stores that you couldn't hit up on Friday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was very interesting that he brought that up. Don't quit until your one thing is done, is what he says. And Gary advocates block time as early in your day as you possibly can. And I think he says this because of the whole fuel tank concept that we introduced earlier in the book, in that you have your most fuel earlier in the day. So use that time for your one thing. And again, when you're working on your one thing, you're not accessible for anything, almost anything. I mean, he does lay out exceptions for if a family emergency, your boss comes and asks you to do something right now. Well, part of your due diligence is to discern if it actually has to be done right now. And it's funny because Gary says most of the time things can wait. I find that a lot. And I can be sometimes dramatic, like, oh, this got to get done right now. Well, and then you start asking yourself, well, does it? Okay, maybe not. I just kind of wanted recognition that I have something important to do, but it can hold off a little bit. I just wanted you to recognize the importance of it. And I don't want to be like left alone with this thing on my shoulders. That's kind of usually what happens. But when you work on your one thing and you block your schedule, the whole point is that's what you're doing in that block of time. And you're not using it for a whole lot of other things. Talking to other people, meeting up with friends, eating, sitting down for like a full meal, making coffee, bullshitting on your phone, none of that. And he actually says when you block off this time, make sure to have anything you need within arm's reach, and you do it you work on your one thing within a certain area. If you have a cubicle, you're in your cubicle for that time, barring any bathroom breaks, of course. Okay, of course. But if you need water, your water's close by. Coffee's close by. Snacks, they are close by. When you walk outside of the area of your work, then you tend to get distracted. Totally happens to me all the time. And Gary recommends, hey, you block 4 hours a day. 4 hours a day at a minimum to work on your one thing. And this last bullet point, or one of the last bullet points here, makers and managers. I thought this was a really cool concept on scheduling, stemming from Paul Graham's 2009 essay. Paul Graham is one of the founders of Y Combinator, which I've heard before. It's a venture capital firm. But Paul talks about there's two different types of schedules, two different types of buckets, a maker schedule and a manager schedule. And he denotes that you split up your time between these two schedules. The maker schedule is where you're doing or creating things. A manager schedule, you're checking emails, you're sending out emails, responding to requests, you're overseeing and directing. And I thought that was a very, very interesting way to break down a schedule. So when you're working on your one thing, you're kind of a maker. You do that when you have the most energy to think about abstract concepts. You're creating, you're connecting dots. You're using a lot of this. Not to say that you aren't when you're managing and overseeing and directing, but I guess it's a different part of the brain that maybe you don't need as much fuel for, so you can get away with doing that at a time of day where your fuel tank is a little bit less, but still operational. It's just what is most conducive. What time of day is most conducive to your one thing? What time of day is most conducive to a maker, to being in this maker mindset? Be a maker in the morning and then a manager in the afternoon, and block your time accordingly to that. And then finally, time block your planning time. Gary actually says, hey, you want to time block an hour each week to review your annual monthly goals, review your one thing, how close you are getting to it. What do you need to do to be on target for your goals? Time block your planning time. So you actually set aside some time to plan. And he tells a cool story about Jerry Seinfeld and this whole concept of not breaking the chain. Seinfeld had essentially established a habit of writing bits every single day for his routine. Writing, was it writing or performing? Yeah, basically doing something comedy related every day, whether that was, I guess, writing or performing. And that's how I looked at it back when I did stand-up comedy too. I do something every day, whether that was open mic or writing or performing a joke in front of myself, in front of the mirror, etc. And every time you do that, you write an X through that day saying, hey, okay, I did what I had to do this day. And you do it every day, and all of a sudden, the X's add up into a chain. And you see the chain, and you become motivated by the length of the chain, like, oh my gosh, I'm actually kind of doing this every day. I'm setting the habit of doing this every day, and all of a sudden, you don't want to break the chain anymore to disappoint yourself. Oh, it's gotten so long. You do it for like a few weeks, and then a month, 2 months, and you just keep doing it and doing it. And that's kind of how the habit sets in. And you start knocking down some dominoes and start getting some momentum. Protect that time block. So when you set aside time for your one thing, protect it at all costs and have this mindset that it cannot be moved. You won't move it. You won't. Phone rings, should be on silent, I guess. You're not going to do anything to move out of the space that you are currently in, move out of the time block that you are currently in for anything else besides your one thing. And again, we talked about this earlier with, okay, what if an emergency comes in, high-level person like a boss? See when the deadline for it actually is, and then go from there. Because if it ends up being later, then respectfully get to it later, because right now you're working on your one thing. But other times you're not going to be able to get to it. Yes, this needs to get done right now. Your boss is going to tell you, okay, totally understand that situation. So you adjust. But if you erase, Gary says, you must replace. So you've only worked on your one thing for 2 hours. You have to find another 2 hours later on that day to make up for the fact that you missed out on the other 2 hours for your one thing. And just remember, everything will become easier or unnecessary when that domino falls. So myself, I get antsy sometimes if I haven't checked my phone in a while, or I haven't looked up something else totally unrelated to my one thing. Like, I'm just so focused on my one thing. But just remember that by virtue of you doing that, everything else will become easier or unnecessary. And let that kind of motivate you. The motivation of seeing that first domino fall and then the second domino fall. Gary has a little trick here, which is interesting. I'm going to actually try this about keeping a brain dump. When something pops up in your head like, oh yeah, I got to do that. Oh, I forgot to text them. Oh, I forgot to call them or look this up, pay this bill, etc., etc., etc. Keep a list next to you and write stuff down. Keep a brain dump. Keep track of things that you want to do. Oh, yeah, I wanted to watch that YouTube video. Just write it down. Because I think what happens, this is especially for me, is I get afraid that I'm going to forget to do something. Let's say I'm working on my one thing, something pops up in my head. Oh, yeah, shoot. I remember I did kind of say that I wanted to do that. And next thing you know, I stop working on my one thing and I go to do the thing that popped up in my head because I'm afraid that I'm going to forget it. So my mindset is, let me just do this right now, take care of this right now. But instead, if I had a list, I could take care of that list after the 4-hour time period. So it's interesting. I'm definitely going to try that out. I'd like to try that out today, actually. I'd never thought about doing that. Lo and behold, though, there's going to be things that distract you from your one thing. So how can you protect against these distractions? Build a bunker. Have a dedicated space for working on your one thing, a space that you don't really leave that often and you have everything within your reach. Store provisions. So coffee, water, snacks, anything you need is within that bunker. And by nature, too, the bunker should be a place that protects you from other people invading in your space. It should be something that tells people, hey, Chris is working on his one thing right now. He's in that special place where he works on his one thing. I don't think we should go and bother him right now. Next, sweep for minds. Turn off your phone, shut down your email, exit your internet browser. I realize that sometimes you need the internet to work on your one thing. Okay, but just don't go crazy with it. Thousands of tabs, checking scores and email, etc., etc., etc. And then enlist support. Tell those around you what you are doing and when you'll be available. And just let people know, hey, it's nothing personal. I'm just working on my one thing. So, final slide. Just the big ideas, the summarizing of this chapter of living by productivity. Or was it living for productivity? Do you guys remember? Living for productivity. Living for productivity, living with a purpose, living by priority. That's what it was. Number 1, connect the dots. Where you want to go is aligned with what you do today. So time block yourself today. Goals set to the now. Remember, we talked about that in the priority section. To see what you need to do today that would make things easier in the future. Time block your one thing. Again, no less than 4 hours a day. Protect that time block. Don't let anything interfere with that time block. And make sure you're focusing for that entire time period. And like I was just saying, protect your time block. Nothing and no one has permission to distract me from my one thing. This is kind of like the mantra that Gary has, and it's a good mantra. Good mantra. I definitely am not great at this. I definitely have let myself get distracted before in the past. I'll give you guys an example today. I had a lot of trouble with the computer. Did I give up on it? And, it was freezing up and stuff. Did I give up and just say, you know what, we're not going to have a video today? Computer's acting up. You know what? No. Restart. Finally, seems like it's working now. All great. We pushed through it. We're going to get this video out to you guys. So yeah, that's that's the chapter. That is living for productivity. Tune in next time. We're going to talk about the 3 commitments, chapter 16. We are so close to being done with this book, guys, and I'm getting excited, especially with some things that, upcoming things. I'm very excited. We're going to be doing some new stuff. So, just stay with me. I appreciate you guys who've been with me all this time and watching the videos, commenting, liking, and we're going to be going some places. And I really appreciate everybody out there. And that's going to do it. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.